On Earth, there are limited resources, limited oil, limited water, and ultimately limited food. Now, we've seen the oil wars, and the water wars are yet up ahead of us. But right now, we have entered into the food wars. Let's talk about it. Welcome to the Poplar Report. I'm Steve Poplar. I'm an accountant by trade, and we cover news stories and trends out there that the mainstream media just won't cover. And one of those here is the ultimate food shortages that are here, and the motivations of nations just to feed their populations. Now, when we look out past the United States, we often project our access to food on other nations. But when we look at other countries, we really shouldn't be doing that. When we project our access to food onto China, we start to add to their motivations or assume their motivations must be based on this or that. When in fact, a lot of the motivations of the countries around us are much more desperate and much more real than what we would naturally think. We would say, well, they want to expand, or they want to conquer other people because they're a bad country. But when in fact, a lot of countries in the world, their conflicts are not based around wanting to invade or expand their territory, but rather one of resources. They're trying to survive, and they know that if they can't provide for their population is going to choose a different government. And that's one of the things that's happening over in China right now. Now, China seems like it's got everything together. They've made all these investments in infrastructure, a little too much into infrastructure. I mean, they've built these ghost cities that nobody lives in. They've built bridges to nowhere. They've built a lot of things that they really don't need. And that's been a lot of wasted money that hasn't gone to feeding their population. The average income in China now is hovering around $10,000 per year. Now, in the United States, you hear that and you go, that's really low. Yeah. The fact is that people can't make ends meet in China. When it comes to housing, and then when it comes to buying food, a lot of people have to make some really tough choices. And I'm not talking about I can't get my favorite brands of food. I'm talking like people just can't. And they're getting pushed out onto the street. They're getting pushed back to the villages. And out in many of these villages, hunger is a real issue. And when they look at their government, they're not looking for opportunity. They're not looking for low tax rates. They're not looking for all the stuff that we would think that they'll be looking for. Rather, they need food. And the government needs to provide jobs, or else people starve. And that is the scary reality of China. And right now, they're being hammered with bad weather. They have a heat wave that has come through and has baked a whole bunch of their crops. Heavy flooding in the south of China, like really heavy flooding. We're talking about towns wiped out, small cities completely underwater. This has knocked out tens of thousands of acres of crops. And when it comes down to it, they rather flood a bunch of farmers' fields than take out another city. And so that's what they've done. They have released a lot of floodwaters out into farmers' fields, flattening their crops, destroying their crops. The food harvests out of China this year are looking like they're going to be pretty bad. And that puts China in a very awkward situation. They already are dependent upon food imports from other countries. If we want to really destroy China, all we'd have to do is just cut off all their food imports and then just watch the whole thing unravel. Of course, when I say that this weakens them and makes it so that they are not as dominant out there, doesn't mean that they're not dangerous. Desperate people and desperate countries do desperate things. Not because they're going to be successful ultimately, but rather because they need to do something. And when China looks over at Taiwan, that is my fear, is not so much that it's part of the 10-year plan to take Taiwan, but rather it's going to be pedal to the metal, because when the government of China feels the pressure to survive, the idea of throwing lots and lots of men and material at capturing an island that has the golden goose on it. TSMC produces much of the world's semiconductors out there, the computer chips, all the highly specialized computer chips out there. Taiwan also produces a lot of other things. It's not quite food self-sufficient, but it does produce a fair amount of food. All that to say that integrating Taiwan into the Chinese economy would help China feed their people. And it would definitely distract a lot of their people from protesting against the government by giving them a sense of national pride. We may find sooner rather than later that the attack on Taiwan may unfold not because of their ambition, but because their desperation. Now, like I said, the water wars are ahead of us, but water and food are not so dissimilar, right? Without water, you can't grow food. And that is a serious problem in Ethiopia. They have 11 million people in food insecurity due to the drought and famine across the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia is in desperate straits, and so in their desperation, they have decided to build one massive super project, the Grand Renaissance Dam, or the GERD, Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The problem is that they built this ginormous dam. It's massive. They built this massive dam across the Upper Nile to control the floodwaters. Now, historically, the floodwaters in Ethiopia would strip the topsoil, send it down the Nile, and then it gets deposited down in Egypt. Egypt, of course, likes this arrangement because it gets lots and lots of fertile topsoil from the forests and from the lands of Ethiopia. Ethiopia doesn't like this at all, because not only do they send all their topsoil down the river so that Egypt can grow food, but secondly, they don't have the opportunity to tap the untapped resource of the Nile. The Grand Renaissance Dam, when fully filled, will provide an enormous amount of electricity to Ethiopia. Electricity that they can use to build their infrastructure, build their economy around. It will save them tons and tons of money that they use to import electricity from other countries surrounding them. But mark my words, Egypt is not happy about this. Egypt has on multiple occasions threatened to bomb the dam, send their fighter jets into Ethiopia and blow the dam up. Well, we've seen Ethiopia slowly filling this dam, and this is a major source of conflict in East Africa between Sudan and Ethiopia, and Egypt and Ethiopia. There is a lot of hard feelings, a lot of discussion about this, and it really does revolve around food. Ethiopia needs to feed their people, and the simple fact is that they're having a real hard time to doing so. Now, Somalia is also having these types of issues, but Somalia is pretty hard for reporters to get into, pretty hard for even UN aid workers to get into. Now, that's just a short distance away, of course, from Yemen. And Yemen, they're shooting missiles at everybody's ships trying to get through. the Suez Canal. And the reason for that, why is that? The civil war in Yemen has ultimately boiled down to people desperate for food. Soldiers fighting for the Houthis are often motivated by the fact that they're being offered food. They're being offered the ability to feed their families. When we go across the world, we see that much of the conflicts are underlying really about food and feeding families, feeding nations. We see some serious concerns unfolding out there. And Africa is really the new Asia. China's population is in decline. They're at like 3 billion people. It's projected in the next 50 years they're going to go down to 750 million people. 1.3 billion people down to 750 million people. Their economy is going to start shrinking. Their average wages, average population income may stay relatively similar, but as their population shrinks, things are going to get really, really interesting. And that's why China is dangerous, but is ultimately not really going to replace the United States as the empire. We really see United States and Russia facing off with each other. Why is that? Well, the United States and Russia are both massive grain and food exporters. The United States has a tremendous amount of leverage still due to U.S. agriculture. We export tons of soybeans, we export tons of corn, we export tons of wheat. And by tons, I mean tons and tons and tons. Lots and lots. And so does Russia. The United States and Russia are in this conflict trying to win over countries in Africa who are food dependent upon food from the outside. And the two biggest exporters of food are Russia and the United States. And this is a big deal. People don't realize that fundamentally that's what it really comes down to, but it is what it really comes down to. When Russia started invading Ukraine, Ukraine was a major food exporter. So Russia and Ukraine, major food exporters going to war with each other, was, let's just say it impacted grain prices out there pretty dramatically until they negotiated a way for them to both export their grains. And this has fallen apart in recent years, but what we're seeing out there, so much of what's happening in the world is revolving around food. And while Western countries don't quite understand what's going on, the third world and the developing economies around the world understand that in order to stay in power, you must feed the people. Whether you're a democracy, whether you're a fake democracy, or whether you're just a downright dictatorship, the simple fact is that the people must be fed. And why is President Putin so popular over in Russia? And yes, he is. Because he feeds his people. There's a war that is claiming many Russian lives, but he's feeding his people. His people's standard of living has increased under the sanctions that the United States have imposed on Russia. It has made it harder to get certain things, for sure. But Russia has thrived and is thriving under the sanctions, and their economy has become so very isolated from the United States and Europe now that they are immune to interference from outside now. And their partnerships that they're building with China and other countries to get raw resources and food into their country. They have their Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan flow food into Russia. And many of the grain growing areas of Russia have been productive. And really when this comes down to it, That's what makes Russia in some ways more dangerous than China. Even though Russia has a much less powerful military than China is building, Russia's navy is legacy, whereas China's navy is being built from the ground up. Ultimately, in the long run, Russia is going to be more dangerous than China. Russia is full of raw resources, food, and their population is relatively small. Whereas China has a much larger population, but it's dependent upon outside resources and outside food, just like Japan was during World War II. As we look at the world, we need to put our goggles on, not our American goggles where there's food everywhere, and the problem is people eating too much food, but rather seeing the world as it is, that food is a powerful motivator to uprisings, people. The whole Arab Spring was revolving around the fact that people didn't have enough food and that food prices were escalating. Well, food prices are going up again today. And we are on the verge of seeing many countries fall and change government styles because the people can't afford the food. We're going to keep an eye on what's going on out there, but we need to keep that all in mind. Indonesia, we haven't even gotten to Indonesia. I'm just going to put that out there. Indonesia is highly unstable, much of because the fact that they have a population that's struggling to feed itself. Now, Indonesia produces a whole bunch of food, but the problem is it's got a massive population and it's growing fast. And that is a danger to itself. It is becoming more and more dependent upon outside imports of food. They've played around with export restrictions on food in order to keep more food inside their country. And we may see some crazy things happen in Indonesia in these coming years. They are one of the largest population countries in the world, and yet they keep a relatively low profile. But that is not going to keep for long. All right, friends, thanks so much for watching. If you want to check out another video from this channel, there's one right up here. I'll see you over there, or I'll see you guys later. Steve Poplar of the Poplar Report, out.